Welcome to another Sleepover with History. I'm Thomas and I'll be your guide through the frozen wasteland of the medieval North tonight. You're not a Hollywood Viking tonight. You're not swinging an axe through a mead hall or sailing gloriously into battle with wind-whipped hair and polished armour. You're something far more desperate and infinitely more human. You're huddled in a smoky longhouse somewhere in 10th century Norway, listening to the wind howl like a living thing that wants to peel the skin from your bones. The darkness outside isn't just night. It's a 4-month sentence that swallows the sun whole and leaves you wondering if spring is just a lie you tell yourself to keep from going mad. You'll learn to sleep with strangers for warmth, to eat things that would make your stomach turn in summer, and to measure time not in days, but in the dwindling pile of firewood that stands between you and freezing to death in your sleep. You'll discover that survival isn't about being strong or brave. It's about being clever, ruthless, and willing to do things that would horrify the person you were before the cold taught you what necessity really means. Before we begin this long journey through the polar night, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. There's something beautifully ironic about people from warm places learning how their ancestors survived when the world tried to kill them every single day. But for now, settle in, pull your blankets close. Let's discover how the Vikings didn't just survive the Arctic winters, they thrived in them, built civilizations in them, and learned to call the frozen darkness home.
The first thing you learn about Arctic winter is that it doesn't arrive, it devours. One day you're harvesting the last bitter turnips from frozen ground, and the next you're watching the sun sink below the horizon for what you pray won't be the last time. But you know better. You've lived through enough winters to understand that the sun is abandoning you, sliding south like a coward, leaving you to face the darkness alone. You stand outside your longhouse in early November, breath-forming clouds that freeze before they dissipate. The air tastes of metal and ice, sharp enough to cut your lungs. Your beard, if you're lucky enough to have grown one thick, is already collecting frost. The wind carries the smell of snow that hasn't fallen yet, a clean, empty scent that promises months of burial. This isn't the gentle winter of southern lands, where frost decorates windows and children play in snow that melts by midday. This is the kind of winter that kills, the kind that turns your spit to ice before it hits the ground, that makes your teeth ache just from breathing, that transforms your own home into a potential tomb if you make even one mistake. You've already made your calculations. 4 months of darkness ahead, maybe 5, if the gods are feeling particularly cruel. The woodpile beside your house represents life measured in logs. Each piece of birch, each precious chunk of pine, each bundle of willow branches is a day you might not freeze to death. You've counted them obsessively, the way a miser counts coins, because the arithmetic of survival is exact and unforgiving. The animals know what's coming. The reindeer have already begun their migration south, their hooves clicking across the hardening ground like an army in retreat. The bears are seeking their caves, heavy with fat that will carry them through the deadness ahead. Even the ravens, those clever black harbingers who usually stay no matter what, have grown quiet and scarce. They know something you're trying not to admit, that some of you won't see spring. Your neighbors are making their final preparations with the grim efficiency of people who understand that sentiment is a luxury they can't afford. The blacksmith is banking his forge fire, feeding it carefully with charcoal that will burn slow and steady through the worst months. The old woman who knows herbs is checking her stores one last time, running her fingers through dried leaves that might mean the difference between healing and death when the scurvy comes. Children who laughed and played through the brief summer now move differently, sensing the tension in their parents' shoulders, the way conversations stop when they enter a room. They don't understand yet that winter isn't just a season here, it's a test. A trial by ordeal that nature administers annually to determine who deserves to see another year. You watch the last merchant ship disappear around the fjord's bend, its sail already heavy with ice. No one else is coming, no supplies, no rescue, no word from the outside world. You're alone now with your community, your preparations, and the growing certainty that before the sun returns, you'll know exactly what you're made of. The first snow falls silently, fat flakes that melt against your face but stick to everything else. Within hours the world transforms. The familiar landscape of your settlement becomes alien, muffled, dangerous. Paths you've walked 1,000 times vanish under white that reflects what little light remains, creating a disorienting brightness that somehow makes the darkness deeper. You retreat inside, but the house feels different now. Smaller, more fragile. The walls that seemed solid in summer now feel like paper against the wind that's beginning to build outside. You can hear it testing the corners, probing for weakness, looking for ways to get inside and steal the warmth from your bones. Your wife, if you're fortunate enough to have one, moves through the house with practiced efficiency, checking the seals around the door, arranging the sleeping furs, rationing the oil for the lamps. She knows as you do, that every resource must be stretched, every comfort measured against survival. Romance is a summer luxury. In winter, love means keeping each other alive. The children gather close to the fire, their faces serious in the flickering light. They're old enough now to understand what's expected of them. No running in and out of the house, letting precious heat escape. No wasting food, no complaining about the cold, no careless handling of the tools that keep the family alive. Winter transforms children into small adults, burdened with responsibilities that would crush them in kinder seasons. You check your weapons one more time, though you know they're clean and sharp. The axe that splits wood also defends against the bears driven desperate by hunger. The knife that cuts meat also settles disputes when cabin fever drives neighbors to violence. The spear that brings down game also serves as a walking stick when the snow gets deep enough to swallow a grown man whole. The first real storm arrives 3 days later, announced by a drop in pressure that makes your joints ache and your dogs whine. The wind builds slowly, then suddenly, like a beast awakening from sleep. It screams around the house, shaking the walls, rattling the shutters you've barred against the cold. Snow doesn't fall, it's driven horizontal, turned into ammunition that scours exposed skin and piles in drifts that can trap you inside your own home. You lie in the darkness, listening to the storm's voice change as it finds different ways to torment your shelter. Sometimes it moans low and mournful, like a giant in pain. Sometimes it shrieks high and sharp, like a woman in labor. Sometimes it stops altogether, and that silence is worse than any sound because you know it's gathering strength for another assault. Your fire burns lower despite your careful feeding. The wind is stealing the heat faster than you can produce it, sucking it up through the smoke hole, through the tiny gaps around the door, through the very pores of the wood itself. You add another log to the flames, calculating how many this storm will cost you, wondering if you've overestimated your supply. The storm lasts 4 days. When it finally passes, you dig your way out through snow that reaches your chest, stepping into a world that has been completely rewritten. Familiar landmarks are gone, buried under drifts that could hide a horse. The path to your neighbor's house is invisible, marked only by the thin line of smoke rising from their chimney, proof that they've survived this first test. You begin the process of digging out, not just your house but your entire life. The woodpile is buried, the well is capped with ice thick enough to stand on. The storehouse door is blocked by snow that will take hours to clear. Every storm means hours or days of recovery, of reclaiming the small space of civilization you've carved out of the wilderness. But you're alive, your family is alive. The fire still burns, the food stores remain intact, and you have enough fuel to last until the next storm. You've passed the first test, but you know it was the easy one. The real winter hasn't even begun. As you work to clear the snow, you notice things. The way the cold makes every sound sharper, clearer, the way the snow squeaks under your boots when the temperature drops below a certain point. The way your breath forms clouds that linger in the still air like ghosts. You're learning the language of winter, reading the signs that will tell you when the next storm is coming, how severe it will be, how long it will last. The sun appears briefly, a pale disk that provides light but no warmth. It slides along the horizon for a few precious hours, casting long shadows that stretch across the snow like fingers. You stop your work to watch it, knowing that each day it will appear for less time, climb lower in the sky, until finally it disappears altogether and leaves you in the endless night. Your neighbors emerge from their own houses, moving carefully across the treacherous snow. No one speaks much. Words freeze in the air, and conversation wastes the energy you need for survival, but you nod to each other, checking that everyone made it through the storm. that no one needs immediate help. Community in winter is measured in small gestures, in the shared understanding that you're all fighting the same enemy. The animals that remain are struggling too. The few hardy birds that didn't migrate huddle in whatever shelter they can find, their feathers puffed out against the cold. The cats and dogs that live around the settlement press closer to the houses, their wild independence overcome by the need for warmth. Even the mice and rats, usually hidden, become bold in their search for food and shelter. You begin to understand that winter here isn't just about cold. It's about the complete transformation of the world, the rewriting of all the rules that govern normal life. Food becomes precious, warmth becomes sacred, light becomes a gift to be hoarded and treasured. Time itself changes, measured not in hours or days, but in the slow consumption of resources, the gradual approach of spring, the careful calculation of what you can afford to use and what you must save. The second storm comes a week later, worse than the first. This time the wind doesn't just howl, it screams, a sound that penetrates your bones and makes your teeth ache. The snow doesn't fall, it drives horizontally, turning the air into a solid wall of white that makes it impossible to see more than a few feet. The cold is so intense that your breath freezes before it leaves your lips, forming ice crystals that cling to your beard and mustache. You huddle around the fire with your family, pressed close together not for comfort but for survival. The flames dance and flicker, fighting against the air that's being sucked up through the smoke hole. You can feel the heat being pulled away, stolen by the wind that seems determined to freeze you in your own home. The walls creak and groan under the assault, and you wonder if the house will hold together until the storm passes. Food becomes a careful negotiation. The stores that seemed adequate in autumn now feel desperately finite. You eat less, not from choice but from necessity. Your wife portions out the dried fish and preserved meat with the precision of a pharmacist, measuring each serving against the weeks of winter that stretch ahead. The children don't complain, but you see the hunger in their eyes, the way they stare at the fire, as if it might somehow provide nourishment. Water is another challenge. The well is frozen solid, and melting snow for drinking water requires fuel you can't spare. You learn to collect ice in containers, letting your body heat slowly melt it into precious liquid. Every drop becomes valuable, rationed and reused until it's too dirty to drink. Washing becomes a luxury reserved for the most necessary hygiene, and even then it's done with handfuls of snow that steal more warmth than they provide cleanliness. The darkness is perhaps the cruelest aspect of Arctic winter. It's not just the absence of light, it's the presence of something else, something that presses against your mind and makes you question your sanity. The long nights stretch endlessly, broken only by the feeble glow of your fire and the occasional oil lamp that you light sparingly, afraid to waste the fuel. You begin to understand why some people go mad in winter, why they walk out into the snow and never return. Sleep becomes fitful and strange. You dream of summer, of warmth and sunlight, and the feeling of sweat on your skin. You wake to find frost on the inside of your breath, ice crystals formed from the moisture in your own lungs. The furs that cover you are stiff with cold, and getting up requires an act of will that grows harder each day. You begin to understand why bears hibernate, why they simply surrender to the season and let time pass without consciousness. Your body changes too. The cold creeps into your bones, making your joints stiff and painful. Your hands become clumsy, less sensitive to touch. Your feet lose feeling, and you have to check them regularly to make sure they haven't frozen without your knowledge. You learn to recognize the signs of frostbite, the white patches of skin that mark flesh beginning to die. You learn to warm these areas carefully, gradually, knowing that too much heat too quickly can cause more damage than the cold itself. The social dynamics of your community shift as well. Privacy becomes impossible when everyone is crowded together for warmth. Personal space is a luxury that must be abandoned in favor of shared body heat. You sleep pressed against neighbors, strangers, anyone who can help keep the cold at bay. Modesty disappears when survival is at stake. Arguments that might have been settled with words in summer now risk escalating to violence because everyone's nerves are frayed by the constant stress of staying alive. Food preparation becomes an art form of conservation. Nothing is wasted, ever. Bones are boiled for soup, then ground into meal. Scraps that would have been thrown away in summer are carefully preserved and incorporated into stews that stretch every calorie. Fat becomes more valuable than meat because it burns cleaner and provides more energy. You learn to eat things that would have disgusted you in warmer months, grateful for any nutrition that might help you survive another day. The animals that share your struggle teach you lessons about survival. You watch the way dogs curl up together in tight balls, conserving heat through proximity. You observe how the cats seek out the warmest spots near the fire, how they move as little as possible to preserve energy. You learn from the way wild animals bulk up before winter, storing fat that will carry them through the lean months. You begin to understand that intelligence isn't just about thinking, it's about adapting, about changing your behavior to match the demands of your environment. As the weeks pass, you develop a different relationship with time. Hours become meaningless when there's no sun to mark them. Days blend together in a continuous struggle against the cold. You mark time instead by the shrinking of your woodpile, the dwindling of your food stores, the gradual accumulation of small victories that mean you're still alive. Each morning that you wake up breathing is a triumph. Each night that you manage to keep the fire burning is a victory against the darkness. The cold becomes a constant companion, a presence that never leaves your side. It's there when you wake up, creeping through the furs that cover you. It's there when you eat, stealing the heat from your food before it reaches your stomach. It's there when you sleep, pressing against your body like a living thing that wants to share your warmth. You learn to live with it, to accommodate it, to respect it as a force that can kill you if you become careless or complacent. But you also learn that you're stronger than you thought. Your body adapts, growing more efficient at conserving heat, more skilled at finding warmth in small things. Your mind adapts too, learning to find entertainment in simple activities, to appreciate tiny comforts that you would have ignored in summer. You discover reserves of endurance and determination that you didn't know you possessed, resources that only reveal themselves under extreme pressure. The community around you begins to show its true character as well. Some neighbors prove themselves generous and supportive, sharing resources and labor when help is needed. Others reveal themselves as selfish and calculating, hoarding their supplies and looking out only for themselves. You learn to identify both types quickly, because in winter, the character of your neighbors can mean the difference between life and death. Children who seemed ordinary in summer reveal themselves as remarkably resilient, adapting to the harsh conditions with a flexibility that adults sometimes lack. They find games to play in the confined spaces, create entertainment from the simplest materials, maintain a spark of joy that helps keep the entire community's spirits alive. You realize that their laughter, however brief and quiet, is as valuable as fuel for the fire. The elderly show their wisdom in ways that weren't apparent in easier seasons. They know which foods will keep longest, which treatments work best for winter ailments, which signs indicate that a storm is coming. Their experience becomes a resource that the community depends on, their knowledge a form of wealth that can't be measured in gold or silver. You begin to understand why societies that survive in harsh environments treat their elders with such reverence. As the deepest part of winter approaches, you realize that you're becoming a different person. The comfortable assumptions of summer life have been stripped away, leaving you face to face with the most basic questions of existence. What do you really need to survive? What are you willing to sacrifice to protect the people you love? How much hardship can you endure before you break? The answers aren't pretty or noble. You discover that you're capable of selfishness you never imagined, that you can make calculations about other people's lives with a coldness that would have horrified your summer self. You learn that survival sometimes requires choices that can't be justified by any moral framework except the simple imperative to stay alive. But you also discover capacities for kindness and sacrifice that surprise you. You find yourself sharing your last bit of food with a neighbor's child, giving your warmest blanket to an elderly person who needs it more than you do. You realize that even in the most desperate circumstances, human beings can choose to help each other, to maintain the bonds that make survival meaningful rather than just biological. The storms continue to come, each one testing your preparations and resolve. You learn to read the signs that predict them, the way the wind changes direction, the particular quality of the cold that precedes a blizzard. the behavior of the animals that still share your environment. You develop an almost supernatural sensitivity to weather patterns, able to sense changes in atmospheric pressure hours before the sky gives visible warning. Your house becomes more than shelter, it becomes a universe. You know every board, every chink, every place where the wind finds entry. You develop routines for maintaining it, checking for damage, reinforcing weak spots. The building becomes an extension of your body, and you tend it with the same careful attention you give to your own health. Fire becomes a living thing that you nurture and protect. You learn to read its moods, to understand when it needs more fuel, and when it's being wasteful. You develop techniques for banking it at night, so it will last until morning, for building it up quickly when storms threaten to steal its heat. The fire becomes a member of your family, as important as any person in the house. Food takes on almost mystical significance. Every meal is a ceremony. Every bite, a conscious choice about how to allocate limited resources. You learn to make dishes that extract maximum nutrition from minimal ingredients, to preserve foods in ways that extend their life indefinitely. Cooking becomes less about taste and more about survival, though you still find ways to make even the simplest meals satisfying. The psychological challenge of winter proves as difficult as the physical one. The constant stress of survival, the endless cold, the monotony of confined life, all of these wear on your mind in ways that are hard to describe. You find yourself snapping at loved ones over trivial matters, obsessing over small problems, feeling despair that threatens to overwhelm your determination to survive. But you also discover mental strategies for coping. You learn to find meditation in repetitive tasks, to escape into memories of warmer times, to focus on small goals that make the larger challenge manageable. You develop a kind of Zen acceptance of discomfort, ability to endure hardship without constantly fighting against it. As the first part of your winter journey comes to an end, you realize that you've already changed in fundamental ways. The person who entered winter is not the same as the one who's learning to survive it. You've shed assumptions, developed new skills, discovered hidden strengths and weaknesses. You're becoming someone who can thrive in conditions that would have destroyed your former self. The darkness outside seems less threatening now, not because it's become less dangerous, but because you've learned to navigate it. The cold is still brutal, but you've developed strategies for dealing with it. The isolation is still challenging, but you've found ways to maintain human connection even in the most confined circumstances. You look at your family, your neighbors, your community, and you see the same transformation in them. People who were soft and comfortable in summer are becoming hard and resilient in winter. Children are growing up faster, learning lessons about life that their southern cousins will never need to know. Adults are discovering capabilities they never knew they possessed. The fire burns steadily in your hearth, a small beacon of defiance against the Arctic night. Your food stores, though diminished, are still adequate for the challenges ahead. Your house, though battered by storms, continues to provide shelter. You've survived the first test of winter, and you're ready for the deeper challenges that await. Outside, the wind continues its assault, but it no longer sounds like a death sentence. It sounds like a conversation, a negotiation between you and the forces of nature. You're learning to speak its language, to understand its moods, to work with it rather than simply enduring it. You're becoming a true child of winter, someone who can not just survive but thrive in the harshest conditions on Earth. The long dark has only just begun, but you're no longer afraid of it. You're ready for whatever comes next.
The long house that shelters you wasn't built by accident. Every timber, every stone, every handful of moss stuffed between the logs represents generations of accumulated knowledge about how to create a pocket of life in a world designed to kill you. You run your hands along the walls in the flickering firelight, feeling the careful craftsmanship that stands between you and death, understanding that your ancestors paid for this knowledge with their lives. The foundation stones were chosen specifically for their ability to conduct heat away from the permafrost below, while preventing the house from sinking into the mud when the brief summer thaws arrive. Each stone was selected, shaped, and placed with the understanding that a single weak point could compromise the entire structure. The builders knew that perfection wasn't an artistic choice, it was a survival requirement.
The walls themselves are a masterpiece of engineering disguised as crude carpentry. The logs are fitted together with joints that tighten as the wood contracts in the cold, creating seals that become more effective as the temperature drops. Between each log, your predecessors packed a mixture of moss, clay, and animal hair that expands and contracts with the seasons, maintaining a barrier against the wind that never stops probing for weakness. But the real genius lies in what you can't see. The double wall construction creates an airspace that provides insulation while preventing the devastating condensation that would turn your shelter into an ice cave. The interior walls are lined with tapestries and furs that aren't just decorative, they're functional insulation that can be adjusted based on the severity of the weather outside. The roof is your first and most important line of defense. The steep angle isn't just for shedding rain. It's designed to shed the enormous weight of snow that would collapse a flatter structure. The turf layer on top provides insulation that modern builders would envy, while the birch bark underneath creates a waterproof barrier that can flex with the movement of the wood without cracking. You've learned to read your house like a living thing, to understand its moods and needs. The way the walls creak in different winds tells you which direction the next storm is coming from. The pattern of ice formation on the interior walls shows you where heat is escaping and where your insulation needs reinforcement. The sound of the wind in the eaves gives you advance warning of weather changes that could kill you if you're not prepared. The smoke hole at the peak of the roof is perhaps the most critical feature of all. Too large, and precious heat escapes faster than you can produce it. Too small, and smoke fills the house, slowly poisoning everyone inside. The adjustable cover allows you to regulate the opening based on wind conditions, but managing it requires constant attention and a deep understanding of how fire behaves in different weather. Your sleeping arrangement isn't about comfort, it's about survival. The raised sleeping platform keeps you off the cold floor while positioning you in the warmest part of the house, where heated air naturally rises. The thick layer of furs and woven blankets creates a microclimate that your body heat can warm and maintain. You sleep together not from choice but from necessity, sharing warmth in a carefully choreographed arrangement that maximizes efficiency. The fire pit dominates the center of the room, but it's not just a source of heat, it's the heart of a complex environmental system. The stones that line it are chosen for their ability to absorb and radiate heat long after the flames die down. The fire itself is built and maintained according to principles that turn fuel into warmth with maximum efficiency. You've learned to read the flames, to understand when they're burning hot and clean versus when they're wasting fuel or producing dangerous smoke. Managing the fire becomes a science that occupies much of your mental energy. Different types of wood burn at different rates and produce different amounts of heat. Birch burns hot and fast, perfect for quickly warming the house when temperatures drop suddenly. Pine burns slower and steadier, ideal for maintaining heat through the night. The precious hardwoods like oak and ash are saved for the coldest days, when their slow, intense burn can mean the difference between life and death. But wood isn't your only fuel. Fat from animals provides concentrated energy that burns with intense heat. Whale oil, when you can obtain it, burns clean and bright, providing both heat and light. Even dried dung from your livestock becomes precious fuel when wood supplies run low. You learn to burn anything that will produce heat, making calculations about energy content that would impress a modern chemist. The art of banking a fire for the night becomes a ritual that determines whether you wake up alive or frozen. You arrange the coals in specific patterns, cover them with ash in precise thicknesses, and position the logs to catch fire at predetermined intervals. Done correctly, your fire will burn slowly through the night, providing steady heat without consuming too much fuel. Done incorrectly, you wake up to a cold house and the dangerous task of rebuilding a fire with numb fingers. Light becomes as precious as heat during the endless dark months. The oil lamps that flicker around your house aren't just for illumination, they're carefully rationed sources of both light and warmth. The wicks are trimmed to precise lengths to control the flame size, and the oil is measured out with the same care you'd give to medicine. Too much light means you'll run out of fuel, too little means you'll injure yourself stumbling around in the darkness. Candles made from rendered animal fat provide backup lighting, but they're smoky and provide little heat. The smell of burning fat becomes another signature of winter life, mixing with the smoke from your fire and the general mustiness of too many people living in too small a space. You learn to appreciate even bad smells because they're signs of life, of warmth, of the small victories that keep you alive. Ventilation becomes a constant balancing act. You need fresh air to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning from your fire, but every breath of outside air that enters your house steals precious heat. You learn to create controlled airflow that brings in just enough oxygen to keep the fire burning and the air breathable without turning your shelter into a wind tunnel. The slightest miscalculation can be fatal. The interior layout of your house reflects the harsh mathematics of survival. Storage areas are positioned to take advantage of temperature differences. Root vegetables in the coolest areas, preserved meats in the driest, oil and fat where they won't freeze solid. Every square foot serves multiple purposes, and nothing is wasted on purely decorative elements. Beauty becomes functional, found in the efficient use of space and the elegant solutions to complex problems. Your workshop area, usually just a corner of the main room, contains the tools that keep you alive. The whetstone for sharpening knives and axes, the awl for repairing leather goods, the needle and thread for mending clothes and furs. These tools aren't just implements, they're lifelines that allow you to maintain and repair the equipment that stands between you and death. You care for them with the same attention you give to your fire, understanding that a broken tool can quickly become a life-threatening emergency. The root cellar beneath your house, if you're fortunate enough to have one, represents months of careful preparation. Dug deep enough to stay below the frost line, it provides natural refrigeration for your food stores. The vegetables buried in sand, the meat packed in salt, the fish preserved in brine, all of these represent summer's abundance carefully hoarded against winter's scarcity. You visit your stores regularly, checking for spoilage, rotating stock, making the calculations that determine whether you'll have enough food to last until spring. Water storage becomes another complex engineering challenge. The barrels and containers that hold your water supply must be positioned where they won't freeze solid, but where they also won't spoil from being too warm. You learn to judge the exact temperature ranges that keep water liquid but safe, understanding that ice-cold water is useless for drinking but that warm water breeds dangerous bacteria. The balance requires constant attention and frequent adjustment. Your animals, if you have them, become partners in survival rather than just sources of food. The cows and goats that crowd into the attached barn provide not just milk and meat, but also precious body heat that warms the entire structure. Their breath creates moisture that you must manage carefully to prevent dangerous condensation, but their presence means the difference between a barely habitable shelter and a reasonably comfortable one. The pigs that root through your garbage aren't just disposal units. They're living furnaces that convert kitchen scraps into body heat and eventually into meat. The chickens that huddle in their coop provide eggs rich with the protein and fat you need to survive, while their feathers become insulation for your clothing and bedding. Every animal serves multiple purposes, and losing even one can disrupt the careful balance that keeps your household alive. Your clothing becomes armor against the cold, but it's not the simple furs and leathers that popular imagination suggests. The layering system you wear represents sophisticated understanding of insulation, moisture management, and temperature regulation. The base layer against your skin is usually fine wool or linen that wicks moisture away from your body while providing initial insulation. The middle layers provide bulk insulation, trapping air in wool or fur that creates a barrier against the cold. The outer layer protects against wind and moisture, while allowing some ventilation to prevent overheating. The boots you wear are marvels of engineering disguised as simple footwear. Multiple layers of leather, fur and wool create insulation that keeps your feet warm even when you're walking on frozen ground. The soles are designed to provide traction on ice while allowing some flexibility for natural movement. The waterproofing comes from carefully applied animal fats that must be regularly maintained to remain effective. Your mittens and gloves represent the difference between functional hands and frostbitten stumps. The mittens keep your fingers together to share warmth, while the gloves allow for detailed work. You switch between them constantly, depending on the task at hand, understanding that exposed fingers can freeze in minutes when the temperature drops low enough. The cord that connects your mittens to your coat isn't just to prevent loss, it's to ensure that you can put them on quickly when your hands start to go numb. The hat you wear isn't just for warmth. It's designed to regulate the enormous amount of body heat that escapes through your head. The ear flaps can be adjusted based on temperature and wind conditions, while the crown provides insulation that can be increased or decreased by adding or removing layers. The face mask that covers your mouth and nose preheats the air you breathe, preventing the lung damage that can occur from breathing extremely cold air directly. Food preparation during winter becomes a complex art that balances nutrition, preservation, and fuel efficiency. The stews that simmer in your pot aren't just meals. They're carefully designed nutritional systems that extract maximum nourishment from minimal ingredients. The long cooking times soften tough preserved meats while breaking down vegetables that would be indigestible raw. The hot liquid provides warmth to your body while the steam adds precious moisture to the dry air inside your house. The bread you bake isn't the light, airy loaves of summer. Instead, it's dense, nutritious, and designed to provide maximum calories per pound. The grain is often supplemented with ground nuts, dried berries, or even sawdust when supplies run low. The sourdough starter that provides leavening is kept alive through careful temperature management, becoming almost a pet that requires daily attention and feeding. Preserved foods become the foundation of your winter diet. The fish that hangs from your rafters, hard as wood and nearly as nutritious, provides protein and fat that your body desperately needs. The meat that's been packed in salt or smoked over carefully tended fires maintains its nutritional value for months. The vegetables that have been dried, pickled or buried in root cellars provide the vitamins that prevent scurvy and other deficiency diseases. Dairy products, when available, provide concentrated nutrition that can make the difference between health and malnutrition. The cheese that ages in your cool storage areas provides protein and fat, while the butter adds calories and vitamins. The milk, whether from cows or goats, must be carefully managed to prevent spoilage while providing fresh nutrition when other sources are scarce. The fermented foods that occupy much of your storage space aren't just preserved nutrition, they're medicine. The beneficial bacteria and fermented vegetables help maintain digestive health when your diet lacks variety. The alcoholic beverages that you drink aren't just for pleasure, they provide calories, prevent infection, and help maintain morale during the darkest months. The mead, beer, and fermented milk products become as important as any other food source. Cooking methods adapt to the limitations of your fuel supply. The single pot that hangs over your fire must serve multiple purposes, often cooking different foods simultaneously through careful layering and timing. The flat stones that heat beside your fire become cooking surfaces for foods that need direct heat. The ashes from your fire provide a cooking medium that maintains steady, gentle heat for foods that need slow preparation. Water management becomes a constant preoccupation. The snow that you melt for drinking water must be clean and free from contamination, but finding clean snow becomes increasingly difficult as winter progresses. The ice that you harvest from nearby water sources must be tested for safety and stored in ways that prevent contamination. The water that you drink must be carefully rationed because producing it requires precious fuel. Waste management in winter presents unique challenges. The human waste that accumulates in your house must be disposed of in ways that prevent disease while not exposing you to dangerous cold. The garbage that your family produces must be managed to prevent attracting dangerous animals while making use of anything that might have value. The ash from your fire must be disposed of carefully because it can contain valuable nutrients for your spring garden. Personal hygiene becomes a careful balance between health and resource conservation. The water you use for washing must be heated using precious fuel, so bathing becomes a rare luxury rather than a daily routine. The soap you use must be made from animal fats that could also be used for food or fuel. The teeth you clean must be maintained without wasting water or exposing yourself to dangerous cold. Medical care during winter depends entirely on your own knowledge and preparation. The herbs and medicines that you've dried and stored during summer become your only defense against illness and injury. The knowledge of traditional remedies that older community members possess becomes literally life-saving information. The bandages and treatment supplies that you've prepared must last through months when no outside help is available. Childbirth during winter becomes an event that the entire community must prepare for. The extra fuel needed to heat the birthing area, the additional food required to support a nursing mother, the care needed for an infant in extreme cold. All of these represent major challenges that must be planned for and managed carefully. The survival of both mother and child depends on resources that are already stretched to their limits. Mental health becomes as important as physical health during the long dark months. The isolation, confinement, and constant stress of survival can drive people to dangerous behaviors. The activities that occupy your mind, storytelling, handicrafts, games, aren't just entertainment but necessary therapy that prevents the psychological breakdown that could endanger everyone in your household. The social structures that govern your winter community become essential for survival. The sharing of resources, the cooperation in major tasks, the resolution of conflicts, all of these must be managed carefully because any disruption could be fatal. The leadership that emerges during crisis situations often determines whether a community survives or perishes. Communication with the outside world becomes nearly impossible during the worst months. The trails that connect your settlement to others become impassable, buried under snow or blocked by ice. The messengers and traders who provide contact with distant communities disappear until spring. You become completely dependent on your own resources and the people who share your immediate environment. The animals that share your winter environment become both resources and competitors. The ptarmigan and Arctic foxes that remain active in winter provide fresh meat when your preserved supplies run low. The seals and whales that can be hunted through ice provide oil and meat that can sustain entire communities. But the polar bears and wolves that are driven to desperation by hunger become deadly threats that must be defended against constantly. The ice that forms on nearby water sources becomes a highway that allows travel when other routes are blocked, but it also becomes a dangerous trap that can swallow travelers who misjudge its thickness. The skills needed to travel safely on ice, reading its color and texture, understanding how current and temperature affect its strength, knowing how to rescue someone who falls through become essential knowledge that every member of your community must possess. The weather patterns that govern your survival become subjects of intense study. The wind directions that predict different types of storms, the cloud formations that indicate temperature changes, the behavior of animals that suggests weather shifts, all of these become part of a complex system of natural forecasting that helps you prepare for conditions that could kill you if you're caught unprepared. The crafts that occupy your time during the long nights aren't just hobbies, they're survival skills that produce essential items. The baskets you weave from willow branches store food and supplies. The rope you make from plant fibers repairs equipment and creates new tools. The leather goods you craft from animal hides provide clothing and containers. Every item you make serves multiple purposes and contributes to your family's survival. The stories that you tell during the long nights aren't just entertainment, they're educational tools that pass down survival knowledge from one generation to the next. The tales of heroes who survived impossible challenges teach practical lessons about dealing with extreme conditions. The myths and legends that describe the natural world provide frameworks for understanding the forces that threaten your survival. The games that you play with your family and neighbors aren't just ways to pass time, they're training exercises that develop the skills you need to survive. The strategy games that require planning and resource management teach principles that apply to real survival situations. The physical games that can be played in confined spaces help maintain the fitness that extreme conditions demand. The music that you make during winter serves multiple purposes beyond entertainment. The singing that accompanies work helps coordinate group activities and maintains morale during difficult tasks. The instruments that you play provide a focus for social gathering that strengthens community bonds. The rhythms that you create help mark time in a season when normal temporal markers disappear. As the deepest part of winter approaches, you realize that you've become part of a system that's far more complex and sophisticated than you initially understood. Every aspect of your life, from the structure of your house to the clothes you wear, from the food you eat to the activities that occupy your time, represents accumulated knowledge about how to create and maintain life in conditions that would kill most people. You've learned to read the subtle signs that indicate changes in weather, to manage resources with mathematical precision, to maintain equipment that your life depends on.
You've developed skills that your ancestors would recognize and respect, becoming part of a tradition that stretches back thousands of years. You've joined the ranks of people who can not just survive but thrive in the harshest conditions on Earth. The fire that burns in your hearth connects you to every generation that has faced the same challenges. The food that sustains you comes from techniques developed over centuries of trial and error. The shelter that protects you represents the accumulated wisdom of countless people who learned through necessity how to create pockets of warmth and safety in a world of ice and darkness. You've become a master of survival, capable of reading the natural world like a book and responding to its challenges with skill and confidence. The person who entered winter worried about survival has become someone who understands that the real challenge isn't just staying alive, it's maintaining the quality of life that makes survival worthwhile. The techniques you've mastered will serve you well in the trials that still await. The knowledge you've gained will be passed down to your children, ensuring that they too can face the challenges of Arctic winter with skill and confidence. You've become part of a tradition that turns survival into an art form, transforming the desperate struggle to stay alive into a sophisticated system of thriving in extreme conditions. The worst of winter still lies ahead, but you're ready for whatever challenges it might bring. You've built the foundation of knowledge and skill that will carry you through the darkest months and into the light of spring. You've become a true child of the Arctic, at home in conditions that would terrify most people, capable of finding not just survival but satisfaction in the harshest environment on Earth.
The moment arrives without ceremony or warning. One morning you wake to discover that the sun, which has been struggling lower and lower on the horizon for weeks, has finally given up entirely. The world outside your walls has become a realm of permanent twilight, lit only by the reflection of snow and the occasional dance of aurora across the star-filled sky. The polar night has begun, and with it comes the deepest test of everything you've learned about survival. You stand at your doorway, looking out at a landscape that has been transformed into something alien. The familiar landmarks of your world, the hills, the trees, the distant mountains, have become shadowy suggestions in the blue-grey light that passes for day. The snow that covers everything glows with an eerie phosphorescence, reflecting starlight and moonlight in ways that make distances impossible to judge. What you thought you knew about your environment has become unreliable, dangerous, potentially deadly. The absence of the sun affects more than just the light. The cold that settles over your world during the polar night is different from the cold you've experienced before. It's not the sharp, clean cold of winter storms, but a deep, penetrating cold that seems to seep through every barrier you've constructed. It finds its way through the tiniest gaps in your walls, through the seams in your clothing, through the careful layers of insulation you've built around your life. This is cold that kills not through sudden shock, but through relentless, patient erosion of warmth. Your fuel consumption doubles, then triples, as you struggle to maintain the heat that keeps your family alive. The carefully calculated stores of wood, oil, and other combustibles that you thought would last through winter begin to dwindle at alarming rates. You find yourself making calculations that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. How much heat can you sacrifice before frostbite sets in? How thin can you stretch your fuel supplies before the mathematical certainty of death becomes unavoidable? The darkness plays tricks on your mind that go beyond simple disorientation. Your body, evolved over millions of years to respond to the cycle of day and night, begins to rebel against the constant darkness. Your sleep patterns disintegrate, leaving you exhausted during what should be active hours and wide awake when you should be resting. The internal clock that regulates your hormones, your digestion, your mood, begins to malfunction in ways that affect every aspect of your existence. Depression settles over your household like a physical weight. The endless darkness triggers responses in your brain that make hope seem impossible, that make every challenge appear insurmountable. The laughter that helped pass the time during the early weeks of winter becomes rare, then disappears entirely. Conversations become strained, then hostile, then stop altogether, except for the bare minimum needed to coordinate survival tasks. The people you love most in the world begin to feel like strangers, then like enemies, then like dangerous obstacles to your own survival. The children in your household suffer most from the psychological effects of the polar night. Their natural energy and curiosity, which helped maintain morale during the earlier months, gives way to listless depression or explosive anger. They cry for reasons they can't explain, rage against restrictions that are necessary for survival, retreat into silences that last for days. The games and activities that previously occupied their time lose all appeal, leaving them staring blankly at the walls or huddled in corners, refusing to participate in the daily routines that keep the household functioning. Your own mental state becomes a battleground between rational knowledge and irrational fears. You know intellectually that the sun will return, that spring will eventually come, that the darkness is temporary. But the primitive parts of your brain, evolved to respond to immediate threats and conditions, begin to whisper that this darkness is permanent, that the world has ended, that there's no point in continuing the struggle to survive. These thoughts become constant companions, requiring active effort to suppress, consuming mental energy that you need for other survival tasks. The social dynamics of your household begin to deteriorate under the stress of confinement, darkness, and resource scarcity. Arguments that would have been minor disagreements in normal circumstances become major conflicts that threaten the cooperation necessary for survival. The personalities that meshed well during the active months of summer and early winter begin to clash in the confined space of your winter shelter. Privacy becomes impossible, personal space becomes a luxury that no one can afford, and the small irritations of communal living magnify into major sources of conflict. Leadership structures that functioned smoothly during the preparation and early survival phases begin to break down as stress and depression affect decision-making abilities. The person who made wise choices about resource allocation and work assignments during the earlier months might become paralyzed by indecision or make increasingly poor judgments that endanger everyone. The democratic cooperation that characterized your household's early winter management gives way to authoritarian control, bitter arguments, or complete breakdown of any organized decision-making process. Food becomes a source of conflict that goes beyond simple scarcity. The preserved foods that seemed adequate during your preparation phase begin to taste monotonous, then disgusting, then barely edible. The lack of fresh ingredients, the repetitive nature of winter meals, and the psychological effects of constant stress combine to create food aversions that can become dangerous. People begin refusing to eat foods that are necessary for survival, or they hoard better-tasting items while others go without, creating inequalities that threaten group cohesion. The rationing system that worked well during the early months becomes a source of constant tension and suspicion. Every portion of food becomes scrutinized for fairness. Every allocation of fuel becomes a potential source of conflict. The mathematical precision required for successful rationing clashes with the human need for occasional indulgence or comfort. The person responsible for managing resources becomes the target of resentment and suspicion, accused of favoritism or hoarding regardless of their actual behavior. Theft becomes a real possibility as resources become scarce and psychological stress undermines social bonds. The extra portion of food, the unauthorized use of fuel, the appropriation of someone else's warm clothing, these violations of communal trust can destroy the cooperation that survival depends on. The need to guard resources against your own family members creates an atmosphere of suspicion and hostility that makes the psychological burden of survival even heavier. Violence becomes a constant threat as stress, confinement, and resource competition push people beyond their normal behavioral limits. The weapons that are necessary for hunting and defense become potential instruments of domestic conflict. The physical strength differences between household members, irrelevant during cooperative times, become significant when cooperation breaks down. The knowledge that you're completely isolated from any outside help makes the possibility of violence more terrifying, because there's no authority to appeal to, no escape from the consequences of conflict. Medical emergencies during the polar night present challenges that go beyond simple lack of resources. The depression and psychological stress that affect everyone in your household can mask serious physical symptoms or make people unwilling to seek or accept help. The vitamin deficiencies that develop from limited winter diets can cause symptoms that mimic mental illness, making it difficult to distinguish between psychological and physical health problems. The lack of sunlight begins to affect bone health, immune function, and mental stability in ways that compound other health challenges. Injuries that would be minor inconveniences during summer become major threats during the polar night. The reduced manual dexterity caused by constant cold makes people more prone to cuts, burns, and other accidents. The compromised healing ability caused by poor nutrition and stress means that minor injuries can become infected or fail to heal properly. The limited mobility caused by extreme weather conditions means that someone who becomes seriously injured might be unable to contribute to survival tasks, placing additional burden on others when resources are already stretched thin. Pregnancy during the polar night presents challenges that test the limits of your community's survival capacity. The extra nutrition required to support a developing baby must come from already limited food supplies. The additional heat needed to maintain proper body temperature for both mother and child requires fuel that might mean the difference between survival and death for other family members. The medical care required for both prenatal health and delivery must be provided by people who are already stressed and potentially suffering from their own health problems. The death of a community member during the polar night creates practical and psychological challenges that can threaten the survival of everyone else. The body must be disposed of in conditions that make burial impossible, and where improper handling could attract dangerous predators. The psychological impact of losing someone during the darkest and most stressful time of year can push other community members over the edge into depression or despair. The loss of a person's labor contribution can upset the careful balance of tasks and responsibilities that keeps the household functioning. Equipment failures during the polar night can quickly escalate into life-threatening emergencies. The axe that breaks while chopping firewood, the pot that cracks while cooking, the lamp that stops working. These aren't just inconveniences but potential death sentences. The materials needed for repairs might not be available, and the skills required for complex repairs might be beyond the abilities of your household members. The cold that makes metal brittle and leather stiff increases the likelihood of equipment failure just when you can least afford it. The psychological pressure of knowing that help is impossible creates a unique form of stress that affects decision-making and risk assessment. Every choice carries potentially fatal consequences, but the information needed to make good choices is often unavailable or unreliable. The conservative approach that minimizes immediate risk might consume resources too quickly, while the aggressive approach that conserves resources might expose people to dangers that could kill them. The responsibility of making these decisions, knowing that mistakes will result in death, creates a psychological burden that can be overwhelming. Fire management becomes a source of constant anxiety as fuel supplies dwindle and the consequences of fire failure become more severe. The person responsible for maintaining the fire must balance the need to conserve fuel against the need to maintain adequate heat. The techniques for banking fires overnight become more critical as the margin for error disappears. The backup plans for restarting fires in emergency situations must be tested and refined, because there might not be second chances. The temptation to burn furniture, tools, or other items that might be needed later becomes a constant internal debate. The chair that could provide several hours of heat might be the only comfortable seating left in the house. The tool handle that could fuel the fire for part of a night might be essential for food preparation or repairs. The decision to burn these items represents irreversible choices that could improve survival chances in the short term, while creating problems later. Water management becomes increasingly difficult as all available water sources freeze solid. The energy required to melt snow or ice for drinking water competes with the energy needed for heat. The containers used for water storage become prone to freezing, which can crack them and destroy precious equipment. The quality of available water becomes questionable, as you're forced to use sources that you would normally avoid. The constant dampness from melting snow and ice creates conditions inside your shelter that promote mold growth and deterioration of stored materials. The clothes and bedding that you depend on for warmth become damp and gradually lose their insulating properties.
The food stores that you've carefully preserved begin to spoil from moisture damage. The wood that you're saving for fuel becomes wet and difficult to burn efficiently. Hunting during the polar night requires skills and equipment that push the limits of what's possible in extreme conditions. The animals that remain active during winter are often more dangerous and unpredictable than those you hunted during milder seasons. The tracking skills that worked in normal lighting conditions become nearly useless in the constant twilight. The weapons and traps that functioned reliably in moderate cold may malfunction in extreme temperatures. The psychological pressure of unsuccessful hunting trips begins to affect the judgment and decision-making of your hunters. The desperation for fresh meat and the knowledge that failure might mean starvation can lead to increasingly risky behavior. The temptation to venture farther from shelter, to hunt in dangerous conditions, or to pursue animals that are beyond your ability to safely kill, becomes harder to resist as food supplies dwindle. The processing and preservation of any game that you do manage to kill becomes more difficult in extreme cold. The meat that you're trying to preserve can freeze solid before you can properly prepare it. The tools needed for butchering become difficult to use with numb fingers and reduced manual dexterity. The waste products from hunting must be disposed of carefully to avoid attracting dangerous scavengers to your shelter. Navigation in the constant darkness becomes a skill that requires techniques and equipment that you may not have mastered. The landmarks that you use to find your way during normal conditions become invisible or misleading in the darkness. The compass that you depend on for direction may be affected by the extreme cold or by the magnetic anomalies that occur in polar regions. The risk of becoming lost just a few hundred yards from your shelter becomes a real possibility that could result in death from exposure. The decision of whether to venture outside your shelter for any reason becomes a complex calculation that weighs necessity against risk. The fuel that you need to gather, the water that you need to obtain, the repairs that you need to make to your shelter, all of these essential tasks require exposure to conditions that can kill quickly. The protective clothing that you wear for outside work becomes a critical life support system that must be maintained and managed carefully. The social isolation that comes from being completely cut off from the outside world begins to affect your sense of reality and connection to the broader human community. The stories and news that would normally connect you to events in the wider world disappear entirely. The trade goods and supplies that would normally supplement your resources become unavailable. The knowledge and skills that other communities possess become inaccessible just when you might need them most. The rituals and traditions that normally mark the passage of time become disrupted by the constant darkness and the focus on immediate survival. The celebrations that would normally provide psychological relief and social bonding become impossible to maintain when resources are scarce and morale is low. The religious or spiritual practices that might provide comfort during difficult times compete with survival tasks for time and energy. The planning for spring becomes a psychological necessity that helps maintain hope, but it also becomes a source of additional stress as you realize how much depends on surviving the remaining months of winter. The seeds that you're saving for planting, the tools that you're maintaining for spring work, the plans that you're making for reconstruction and recovery. All of these represent hope for the future, but they also represent additional responsibilities and concerns that add to your current stress. The educational activities that you plan to pursue during the long winter nights become impossible to maintain when survival consumes all available time and energy. The skills that you wanted to teach your children, the crafts that you wanted to learn, the maintenance tasks that you wanted to complete, all of these productive activities give way to the simple struggle to maintain the basic conditions necessary for life. The record keeping that helps you track resource consumption and plan for future needs becomes more critical as supplies dwindle, but it also becomes a source of psychological stress as the numbers make clear how precarious your situation has become. The careful calculations that show exactly how long your food will last, how much fuel you're consuming, how many days until spring, these mathematical realities become constant reminders of how close you are to the edge of survival. The backup plans that you developed for various emergency situations must be constantly reviewed and updated as conditions change and resources become scarce. The alternative shelter locations that you identified, the emergency food caches that you prepared, the escape routes that you mapped, all of these contingency plans must be maintained and kept ready for use, even though implementing them would represent a major crisis. The leadership decisions that determine how resources are allocated, how tasks are assigned, and how conflicts are resolved become more critical as the margin for error disappears. The person or people responsible for making these decisions must balance immediate survival needs against long-term strategic considerations, individual needs against group welfare, and limited resources against unlimited demands. The communication between household members becomes more important as cooperation becomes more critical, but it also becomes more difficult as stress and depression affect everyone's ability to express themselves clearly and respond appropriately to others. The misunderstandings that result from poor communication can escalate into conflicts that threaten group survival. The information that needs to be shared about resource status, task assignments and emergency procedures must be communicated clearly, despite the psychological barriers that stress creates. The personal relationships that bind your household together become both more important and more fragile as external pressures increase. The love and loyalty that motivate people to share resources and support each other during crisis situations compete with the survival instincts that prioritize individual welfare over group welfare. The bonds that seemed strong during easier times may prove insufficient to withstand the pressures of extreme survival situations. The mental exercises and psychological techniques that help maintain morale and hope become essential survival skills that must be practiced and refined. The stories that you tell yourself about your situation, the goals that you set for future achievement, the positive aspects of your current circumstances that you focus on. All of these mental strategies require conscious effort and constant reinforcement to remain effective. The physical fitness and health maintenance that seemed less important during the early months of winter become critical as the physical demands of survival increase. The strength needed to perform essential tasks, the endurance required for difficult work, the health necessary to resist illness and injury. All of these physical capabilities must be maintained, despite limited nutrition and reduced activity levels. The emergency procedures that you've practiced for various crisis situations must be ready for immediate implementation as the likelihood of emergencies increases. The fire starting techniques that you've learned, the first aid skills that you've developed, the repair procedures that you've mastered, all of these emergency capabilities become more important as the consequences of failure become more severe. As you face the deepest part of the polar night, you realize that survival has become more than just a matter of having adequate resources and technical skills. It's become a test of psychological endurance, social cooperation, and spiritual strength that challenges every aspect of your humanity. The person who entered winter confident in their preparation and abilities must now confront the reality that survival depends on factors that can't be stockpiled or practiced in advance. The darkness that surrounds your shelter becomes a metaphor for the psychological and social challenges that threaten to destroy your community from within. The cold that penetrates every barrier you've constructed becomes a symbol of the relentless pressure that tests every aspect of your survival system. The isolation that cuts you off from the outside world becomes a mirror that reflects back only your own resources and capabilities. You've learned that the most dangerous enemies during the polar night aren't the obvious physical threats, the cold, the darkness, the scarcity of resources. The most dangerous enemies are the psychological and social forces that can destroy your will to survive, your ability to cooperate with others, and your capacity to make the rational decisions that survival requires. These internal enemies are more subtle than external threats, but they're ultimately more deadly because they attack the human qualities that make survival possible. The techniques for managing these internal threats become as important as the techniques for managing physical survival challenges. The mental discipline required to maintain hope in seemingly hopeless situations, the emotional intelligence needed to manage interpersonal conflicts, the spiritual resources that provide meaning and purpose during the darkest times. All of these become essential survival skills that determine whether you'll emerge from winter as an intact human being or as a broken survivor. The deepest part of the polar night teaches you that survival isn't just about staying alive, it's about maintaining the qualities that make life worth living. The humanity that you preserve during the darkest months becomes the foundation for rebuilding and recovery when spring finally returns. The relationships that you maintain during the most stressful times become the bonds that hold your community together during reconstruction. The hope that you nurture during the most hopeless moments becomes the motivation that drives you toward future achievements. The knowledge that you're gaining about the limits of human endurance, the dynamics of group survival, and the psychological requirements for extreme situations becomes wisdom that will serve you throughout your life. The skills that you're developing for managing resources, resolving conflicts, and maintaining morale become capabilities that will make you a more effective leader and community member. The understanding that you're gaining about your own psychological and physical capabilities becomes self-knowledge that will inform all your future decisions. The polar night, that once seemed like an impossible challenge, has become a transformative experience that's teaching you things about yourself and about human nature that you could never have learned in normal circumstances. The darkness that threatened to destroy you has become a teacher that's showing you the true sources of strength and resilience. The isolation that seemed like a curse has become an opportunity to discover what you're truly capable of when all external supports are removed. As you prepare for the trials that still lie ahead, you realize that you've already survived the worst of what winter can throw at you. The person who trembled at the first sign of polar night has become someone who can face the deepest darkness with courage and determination. The community that seemed fragile and unprepared has become a survival unit that can function effectively under the most extreme conditions. The sun will eventually return, spring will eventually come, and the world will eventually emerge from the grip of winter. But the person who emerges from this experience will be fundamentally different from the person who entered it. You'll have joined the ranks of those who have faced the ultimate test of human survival and emerged not just alive, but stronger, wiser, and more capable than before. The darkness that once threatened to destroy you will have become the crucible in which you forged a new and more resilient version of yourself.
The first hint of change comes not through sight, but through feeling, a subtle shift in the quality of darkness that your body recognizes before your mind can process it. After months of living in the depths of polar night, your senses have become attuned to variations in shadow and starlight that would be invisible to someone from the outside world. The darkness that has been your constant companion for so long begins to show the faintest suggestion of variation, a rhythm that hints at the return of something long forgotten. You stand at your doorway in what you hope is morning, though the concept of morning has become almost meaningless during the endless night. The stars that have been your only reliable markers of time still shine with their familiar intensity, but something in the eastern sky suggests a change that goes beyond your desperate imagination. The aurora, that has provided your only source of moving light, continues its ethereal dance, but even its patterns seem different, as if the very atmosphere is preparing for a transformation that will reshape your world. The cold that has been your constant enemy shows no sign of retreating. If anything, it seems to have intensified as the deepest part of winter approaches its peak. The breath that steams from your mouth in the doorway freezes instantly, creating ice crystals that tinkle to the ground like tiny bells. The snow beneath your feet squeaks with the particular sound that comes only when temperatures drop to their most extreme levels. Your body, weakened by months of inadequate nutrition and constant stress, struggles to generate the heat necessary to maintain core temperature even for the few minutes you spend outside. But something has changed in the rhythm of your days, something that your body recognizes even when your mind refuses to believe it. The sleep patterns that have been chaotic throughout the polar night begin to show hints of regularity. The depression that has weighed on your household like a physical presence seems to lift slightly, allowing moments of hope to break through the psychological darkness. The children who have been listless and withdrawn begin to show flickers of their former energy, asking questions about when the sun will return, and making plans for activities that seemed impossible during the deepest dark. The resources that have sustained your household through the polar night are stretched to their absolute limits. The carefully calculated stores of food, fuel, and other necessities that seemed adequate during your autumn preparations have been consumed at rates that your planning couldn't have anticipated. The extra calories needed to maintain body heat in extreme cold, the additional fuel required to combat the deeper cold of polar night, the unexpected losses from equipment failures and inefficiencies, all of these factors have combined to create a resource crisis that threatens to destroy your community just as survival begins to seem possible. Your food stores, which once filled storage areas throughout your shelter, have been reduced to a collection of containers that can be counted on one hand. The preserved meats that were your primary source of protein have been rationed to portions that leave everyone constantly hungry. The dried vegetables and fruits that provided essential vitamins have been consumed so sparingly that deficiency diseases have begun to appear among your household members. The grains that formed the foundation of your winter bread have been stretched with sawdust, bark and other materials that provide bulk but little nutrition. The fat and oil that have been crucial for both nutrition and fuel have been consumed at rates that make every meal a calculation of survival mathematics. The whale oil that provided clean burning light and heat has been reduced to a few precious containers that are saved for only the most critical needs. The rendered animal fat that you've used for cooking and lamp fuel has been rationed to quantities that make every flame a luxury that must be carefully justified. The butter and cheese that provided concentrated nutrition have been consumed so carefully that each portion is measured with the precision of a pharmacist dispensing medicine. Your fuel situation has become even more desperate than your food supplies. The wood that you spent months gathering and preparing has been consumed at rates that leave you with perhaps weeks of heating fuel remaining. The carefully split logs that you expected to last through the entire winter have been supplemented with furniture, tools and other items that you never intended to burn. The coal and charcoal that you managed to acquire have been rationed so strictly that you've learned to extract every possible calorie of heat from every piece. The alternative fuels that you've been forced to use, dried dung, paper, cloth and anything else that will burn, have provided heat, but at the cost of filling your shelter with smoke and odors that make life barely tolerable. The oil lamps that provided both light and heat have been reduced to burning for only a few hours each day, leaving your household in darkness for most of the time. The candles that you made from rendered fat have been saved for only the most essential activities, making every flame a precious resource that must be protected and conserved. Yet despite the desperate state of your resources, something in your household's atmosphere has begun to change. The constant tension and conflict that characterized the deepest part of winter have been replaced by a different kind of focus, a shared recognition that survival is possible if everyone continues to work together. The arguments about resource allocation have been replaced by discussions of how to stretch remaining supplies until spring. The depression that made every day a struggle has been lightened by the first tentative hopes that the worst might be behind you. The work that occupies your days has shifted from desperate survival maintenance to active preparation for spring. The tools that you've been maintaining throughout winter are now being sharpened and prepared for the heavy work of reconstruction and recovery. The seeds that you've been protecting in your coldest storage areas are being checked and prepared for planting. The plans that you've been making for spring activities are being refined and detailed as the reality of survival becomes more certain. Your household members have begun to emerge from the psychological shells that they constructed to protect themselves during the darkest months. The conversations that had been reduced to essential communication about survival tasks have expanded to include planning, speculation, and even occasional laughter. The children who had retreated into silent withdrawal have begun to participate in household activities and to show interest in the world beyond their immediate survival needs. The adults who had been focused entirely on immediate challenges have begun to think about long-term recovery and rebuilding. The crafts and productive activities that had been abandoned during the crisis of the polar night have been gradually resumed as resources allow. The repair work on tools and equipment that had been delayed due to lack of materials or energy has been started again. The creation of new items needed for spring work has begun, using whatever materials can be spared from immediate survival needs. The maintenance of your shelter that had been postponed during the worst of winter has been resumed as conditions allow, but the most significant change has been in the quality of light that filters through your windows and penetrates the cracks in your walls. What began as a subtle variation in the darkness has gradually become a distinct lightening of the eastern sky during what you hope are the morning hours. The stars that have been your primary source of light begin to fade slightly during certain periods, suggesting that something brighter is approaching the horizon. The aurora that has provided your only moving light begins to appear less frequently, as if stepping aside for something more significant. The first actual glimpse of the sun, when it finally comes, is almost anticlimactic after months of anticipation. A tiny sliver of golden light appears on the horizon for just a few minutes, so brief that you wonder if you've imagined it. But the warmth that you feel on your face, even through the extreme cold, confirms that this is real. The sun has begun its return to your world. The light that touches your face for those few precious minutes carries with it the promise of warmth, of spring, of life, returning to a world that has been gripped by death for so long. The psychological impact of seeing the sun, even for such a brief time, is profound and immediate. The depression that has weighed on your household for months begins to lift as if a physical burden has been removed. The hope that had been carefully rationed like your other resources begins to flow more freely, energizing activities and conversations that had been mechanical and lifeless. The children who had forgotten what the sun looked like react with wonder and excitement that reminds you of what joy feels like after months of grim endurance. But the return of the sun also brings with it the sobering realization of how much damage the winter has done to your world and your community. The structures that you built to protect yourself from the cold show signs of stress and damage that will require extensive repair. The equipment that you've been using for survival tasks shows where that will need to be addressed before it can be relied upon for spring work. The landscape that you remember from autumn has been transformed by months of extreme weather into something that will require careful assessment and planning to navigate safely. Your household members, while psychologically lifted by the return of light, show the physical effects of months of inadequate nutrition and extreme stress. The weight loss that everyone has experienced has left people gaunt and weakened, requiring careful management of recovery to avoid the medical complications that can result from too rapid refeeding. The vitamin deficiencies that have developed from the limited winter diet have created health problems that will require attention and treatment. The dental problems that have developed from poor nutrition and limited hygiene will need to be addressed before they become serious health threats. The social dynamics of your household, while improved by the return of hope, still bear the scars of the conflicts and tensions that developed during the darkest months. The trust that was damaged by resource competition and survival stress will need to be rebuilt through careful attention and demonstrated reliability. The leadership structures that were strained by the pressures of crisis decision-making will need to be re-established on foundations that can support the different challenges of recovery and rebuilding. The planning that now occupies much of your time focuses on the complex transition from survival mode to recovery mode. The resources that remain must be carefully managed to support both immediate survival needs and the investments required for spring activities. The work that needs to be done to prepare for spring must be balanced against the need to conserve energy for the remaining weeks of winter. The decisions about what to repair, what to replace, and what to abandon must be made with careful consideration of available resources and time. The hunting and foraging that become possible as wildlife begins to return to your area provide the first fresh food you've had in months, but they also present challenges that your weakened condition makes difficult to meet. The skills that you developed for winter hunting must be adapted to the changing conditions as daylight gradually returns. The equipment that you've been maintaining for hunting activities must be tested and prepared for use after months of storage. The processing and preservation of any fresh food that you obtain must be managed carefully to maximize its nutritional and psychological benefits. The water situation that has been a constant challenge throughout winter begins to improve as the longer periods of daylight provide more opportunities for melting snow and ice. The techniques that you've developed for water procurement and management during the darkest months can be refined and made more efficient as conditions improve. The quality of available water sources begins to improve as natural processes resume some of their normal functioning.
The energy required for water production becomes more manageable, as fuel supplies can be allocated more efficiently. The gradual increase in daylight hours creates opportunities for activities that have been impossible during the polar night. The assessment of your property and surrounding area that couldn't be done safely in darkness becomes possible, allowing you to evaluate winter damage and plan for repairs. The gathering of materials for spring work can begin as visibility improves and travel becomes safer. The maintenance of your shelter that couldn't be done effectively in darkness can be resumed and completed properly. The psychological benefits of increasing daylight extend beyond simple mood improvement to include restoration of normal sleep patterns and cognitive function. The circadian rhythms that were disrupted by constant darkness begin to re-establish themselves, improving both sleep quality and daytime alertness. The decision-making abilities that were impaired by stress and sleep deprivation begin to return to normal levels. The memory and learning functions that were affected by the extreme conditions of winter begin to recover their normal efficiency. But the return of light also reveals the full extent of the challenges that lie ahead. The damage to your shelter that was hidden by darkness becomes visible, showing the scope of repair work that will be needed. The condition of your stored materials and equipment becomes apparent, revealing losses and damage that will need to be addressed. The state of your surrounding environment becomes clear, showing changes that will affect your spring and summer activities. The food situation, while still critical, begins to show signs of improvement as the increasing daylight makes foraging and hunting more productive. The plants that have survived under the snow begin to show signs of life that promise future food sources. The animals that have been absent during the darkest months begin to return to your area, providing opportunities for fresh meat and other resources. The fish that have been inaccessible under thick ice begin to become available as ice conditions change. The fuel situation remains critical, but the increasing daylight reduces the heating requirements slightly and provides opportunities for gathering additional fuel materials. The dead wood that couldn't be located safely in darkness becomes available for collection. The alternative fuel sources that couldn't be prepared effectively in winter conditions can be developed and utilized. The more efficient use of available fuel becomes possible as heating requirements begin to decrease. The social connections with other households and communities that were severed by winter conditions begin to become possible, again as travel becomes safer and more practical. The news and information that you've been cut off from during the isolation of winter begins to become available through contact with other survivors. The trade and cooperation that provide access to resources and skills that your household lacks begin to resume on a limited basis. The emotional support that comes from knowing that others have survived similar challenges becomes available through renewed social contact. The planning for spring activities becomes more detailed and practical as the reality of survival becomes more certain. The agricultural preparations that will be needed for food production can be planned and initiated. The construction and repair work that will be required for shelter and equipment can be organized and prepared. The resource gathering and production activities that will be needed for next winter can be planned and begun. The educational activities that were suspended during the crisis of winter can be resumed and expanded. The skills that you've learned through necessity during the survival period can be formally taught to other household members. The knowledge that you've gained about resource management, crisis planning, and extreme survival can be organized and preserved for future use. The lessons that you've learned about human nature, community cooperation, and personal resilience can be reflected upon and integrated into your understanding of life. The spiritual and philosophical insights that have emerged from the experience of extreme survival begin to be processed and understood. The questions about the meaning of life, the nature of human strength, and the importance of community that have been raised by your experiences begin to be explored and answered. The changes in your understanding of what is truly important in life begin to be integrated into your future planning and decision-making. The recovery process that lies ahead will be as challenging in its own way as the survival period has been. The physical rehabilitation that will be needed to restore your health and strength will require careful management and adequate resources. The psychological healing that will be needed to process the trauma and stress of extreme survival will require time and support. The social reconstruction that will be needed to rebuild damaged relationships and community structures will require patience and wisdom. The preparation for next winter that must begin as soon as spring arrives will be informed by the hard-won knowledge that you've gained through this experience. The resource calculations that seemed adequate before will be adjusted based on your new understanding of consumption rates and emergency needs. The equipment and supplies that you thought were sufficient will be supplemented based on your experience of what actually works in extreme conditions. The skills and knowledge that you thought you possessed will be expanded and refined based on what you've learned about the reality of survival. The rebuilding of your physical environment will provide opportunities to improve upon the systems and structures that supported your survival. The shelter that protected you through winter can be strengthened and improved based on your experience of its weaknesses and failure points. The storage and preservation systems that maintained your resources can be expanded and refined based on your understanding of what worked and what didn't. The tools and equipment that you relied upon for survival can be upgraded and supplemented based on your experience of their limitations and capabilities. The restoration of your social and economic relationships will provide opportunities to share the knowledge and skills that you've gained through your survival experience. The techniques that you've developed for resource management and crisis planning can be shared with others who may face similar challenges. The insights that you've gained about human behavior under extreme stress can be used to help others prepare for and manage difficult situations. The leadership skills that you've developed through crisis management can be applied to community development and improvement. The transformation that you've undergone through the experience of extreme survival will continue to influence your life long after the immediate crisis has passed. The confidence that comes from knowing that you can survive anything that life throws at you will affect your approach to all future challenges. The understanding that you've gained about what is truly important in life will influence your priorities and decisions. The appreciation that you've developed for the simple pleasures and comforts of normal life will enhance your enjoyment of good times. The wisdom that you've gained about the fragility of human life and the importance of preparation will influence your approach to risk management and security planning. The knowledge that you've acquired about the psychology of crisis and survival will help you assist others who face similar challenges. The skills that you've developed for resource management and efficiency will serve you well in all areas of life. The resilience that you've built through overcoming extreme adversity will provide strength for facing future difficulties. The memory of the darkest days will remain with you always, but it will be balanced by the memory of overcoming them. The fear and despair that you experience during the worst moments will be tempered by the knowledge that you survived them and emerged stronger. The relationships that were tested by extreme stress will be strengthened by the shared experience of overcoming impossible challenges. The community that was forged in the crucible of survival will be bound together by bonds that can withstand any future test. As the sun continues to rise higher each day and the daylight hours gradually increase, you begin to see the first signs of spring approaching. The snow that has been your constant companion for months begins to show subtle changes in texture and color. The ice that has locked your world in its grip begins to show the first hairline cracks that promise eventual release. The wildlife that has been absent during the darkest months begins to return in small numbers, bringing with it the promise of abundant food and resources. The work that now occupies your days shifts from desperate survival maintenance to active preparation for the abundance that spring will bring. The tools that you've maintained through winter are sharpened and prepared for the heavy work of construction and agriculture. The seeds that you've protected through the cold months are prepared for planting. The plans that you've made for recovery and rebuilding are refined and detailed as the reality of survival becomes certain. The psychological transformation that has occurred through your experience of extreme survival becomes more apparent as normal life begins to resume. The person who entered winter with confidence based on preparation and planning has emerged with confidence based on proven ability to survive anything. The individual who thought they understood their own capabilities has discovered depths of strength and resilience that they never knew existed.